The desert shows no mercy. Sawyer knew that better than anyone. He had seen men stronger than him fall to their knees before the relentless sun. He had seen horses give up when thirst robbed them of their very last breath. But never, in all his years riding through these wild lands, had he seen a storm like the one rising on the horizon. It was as if the sky itself had become an enemy of the earth. A wall of ochre sand rose from the ground to the clouds, advancing with the fury of 1,000 runaway horses. The wind was already beginning to bite, flinging tiny grains that cut the skin like minuscule invisible needles. Sawyer adjusted his hat and looked back. His cattle had disappeared 3 days ago, scattered by a nighttime stampede he still couldn't explain. 300 head of cattle, an entire season's work, lost in the vastness of the desert. Now all he had left was Thunder, his faithful black horse, and the few provisions in his saddlebags. "Come on, boy," he murmured to the horse as he stroked its neck. "We need to find shelter or this storm is going to bury us alive." Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this story, and write in the comments which country you're watching from. It makes us very happy and motivates us to keep creating stories for you. Thunder neighed nervously, sensing the electricity in the air. Animals always know when danger is approaching, long before humans do. Sawyer spurred him gently, and the horse began to gallop east, where some rock formations promised some kind of protection from the wind's fury. The sand was already forming whirlwinds around him. Sawyer covered his mouth with his red bandana and squinted, desperately searching for any sign of shelter. The world was turning yellow, blurry, completely hostile. Then he saw it, a small cabin built with wood and adobe, almost invisible against the desert landscape. It looked abandoned, with dark windows and no horses tied up outside. But at that moment, Sawyer didn't have the luxury of being picky. He dismounted in one swift movement and guided Thunder toward a small, attached stable that was barely standing. The horse entered gratefully, escaping the wind that howled like a wounded, hungry animal. Sawyer secured the door with a wooden beam and ran toward the main cabin. The door was closed. He knocked 3 times with his fist. "Anyone there? I need shelter. The storm is coming." Absolute silence. Sawyer pushed the door and it opened with a long groan. The interior was dark, barely lit by the fading light filtering through the dust-covered windows. He took a step inside, letting his eyes slowly adjust to the dimness. And then he saw them. 10 women, all young, all with hair as black as night and cinnamon-colored skin. They were huddled in a corner of the cabin, watching him with eyes that mixed fear with something deeper, absolute distrust. They wore traditional leather dresses decorated with colorful beads and feathers. They were Apache. Sawyer stood motionless in the doorway. The wind roared outside, pushing sand through every crack in the cabin. One of the women, the one who seemed to lead the group, stepped forward. She had fierce eyes like an eagle's and a posture that showed not a trace of fear. "Leave," she said in Spanish. Her voice was as firm as rock. "You are not welcome here, stranger." Sawyer slowly raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. Very carefully, he removed his belt with his revolver and let it fall to the dirt floor. "I only seek shelter from the storm," he said, keeping his voice as calm as possible. "I mean you no harm, I swear it on my life." The woman who had spoken, whom the others clearly respected as their leader, studied him with a penetrating gaze. Her eyes scanned his tired face, his empty hands, the abandoned gun on the floor. "My name is Nolly," she said finally after a long silence. "These are my sisters, not by blood, but sisters nonetheless. Our men died 1 moon ago. A terrible fever took them all, one by one." Sawyer felt a heavy weight in his chest upon hearing those words. 10 women alone in the middle of the desert, without any protection, without anyone to help them. "I'm so sorry," he said, and he meant it completely. "That must have been terribly hard for all of you." Nolly did not respond to his words. Instead, she pointed to a corner opposite the one where the women were gathered. "You can stay there until the storm passes, but when the wind calms, you will leave here immediately." Sawyer nodded without protest and walked toward the indicated corner. He sat on the dirt floor with his back against the cold wall and watched the group of women. Some looked at him with poorly disguised curiosity, others with evident hostility, but one of them, the youngest of the group, looked at him in a completely different way. She had large, dark eyes like 2 deep wells full of mysteries. Her face was delicate, almost fragile, and Sawyer noticed she was trembling slightly, not from fear, but from intense cold or perhaps a fever. The storm battered the cabin mercilessly. The wind found every crack, every tiny hole, whistling sinister melodies that chilled the blood. The sand scraped against the walls like 1,000 desperate fingernails trying to get in. Sawyer watched the trembling young woman with concern. The other women surrounded her protectively, trying to keep her warm with their bodies, but it was clear they didn't have enough blankets for everyone. Without a second thought, Sawyer took off his thick wool blanket, his only protection against the desert's deadly cold, and walked toward the group. Nolly immediately stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "What do you think you're doing?" Sawyer extended the blanket toward her calmly. "For her," he said, gesturing toward the sick young woman. "She needs it far more than I do. Please accept it." Nolly looked at the blanket, then at Sawyer, then at the young woman who wouldn't stop trembling violently. For a moment, her hard expression softened almost imperceptibly. She took the blanket and brought it to the young woman, wrapping her in it with maternal care. "Her name is Paloma," Nolly said without turning to look at him. "She has been fighting a fever for 3 days. Sawyer returned to his corner and sat down again on the cold floor. The cold was beginning to bite into his bones mercilessly, but he didn't mind at all. He had done the right thing, and that was enough. Night fell over the desert, though it was impossible to distinguish it from day under that furious storm. Sawyer closed his eyes but couldn't sleep. He listened to Paloma's labored breathing, the worried whispers of the other women, the constant pounding of sand against the walls. Sometime during the night, he opened his eyes and found Nolly watching him intently from the other side of the cabin. Their eyes met in the darkness. She said nothing at all, but Sawyer could see that something had shifted between them. A small gesture of humanity had opened a tiny crack in the wall of distrust. The storm continued to rage outside with all its fury, but inside that little cabin lost in the desert, something new was beginning to be born. The hours passed slowly, like drops of honey falling from an old spoon. The storm showed no signs of calming for a moment. The wind howled like a hungry wolf in the darkness, shaking the cabin walls with relentless fury. Sand seeped through every crack, forming small golden mounds on the dirt floor. Sawyer remained in his corner completely still, arms crossed over his chest to conserve some warmth. Without his blanket, the cold of the desert night bit through to his bones mercilessly. But every time he looked toward where Paloma lay, wrapped in that thick wool, he knew he had made the right decision. The women spoke among themselves in low voices in their native tongue. Sawyer didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone of the conversation perfectly. They were talking about him, no doubt. Some voices sounded annoyed and sharp, others simply curious, and a few were clearly frightened by the stranger's presence. Nolly stayed awake, watching every movement. Her dark eyes gleamed in the dim light like a nocturnal animal protecting its pack. She didn't trust the stranger, that was more than evident, and Sawyer didn't blame her at all. In these difficult and dangerous times, trust was a luxury that few could afford. "Why are you traveling alone through the desert?" Nolly's voice broke the heavy silence of the night. Sawyer looked up and found her watching him intently from across the dark room. "I lost my cattle," he answered honestly. "A stampede 3 nights ago, 300 head, everything I had in this world. I was looking for them when I saw the storm approaching on the horizon." "And your family? Does your wife wait for you somewhere?" "I have no wife, no family either. I only had that cattle and my horse, Thunder, nothing else." Nolly processed the information in silence for several seconds. One of the other women, with a round face and a naturally kind expression, approached her and whispered something urgently in her ear. Nolly nodded slightly. "Sitlali wants to know if you are hungry," Nolly said, gesturing toward the woman who had spoken. Sawyer immediately shook his head. "Save your food for yourselves. You will need it far more than I will in the days to come." Another exchange of meaningful glances between the women, another small crack in the wall of distrust that separated him from the stranger. The night continued its slow, endless march. Paloma was now sleeping more peacefully. Her breathing was calmer than before. The fever seemed to have subsided a little, perhaps thanks to the comforting warmth of the blanket. The other women also began to fall asleep gradually, one by one, until only Nolly and Sawyer remained awake in the darkness. "A moon ago we were 20 people," Nolly said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the constant roar of the wind outside. 10 strong men, 10 brave women. We had horses, enough provisions, dreams of finding a better place to the north where we could live in peace." Sawyer listened in respectful silence. He instinctively knew that Nolly needed to tell this story to someone. "The fever came without warning. First, our leader fell, older sister's husband. He was a man as strong as an oak, but the fever brought him down in 3 days. Then the others fell one after another without us being able to do anything. In 10 terrible days, all our men had died. We buried them on the hill just behind this cabin. Did you find this cabin abandoned by chance? Yes, it was fate. Whoever lived here left long ago, perhaps years. They left some basic provisions and useful tools. We decided to stay here until Paloma fully recovered, but the fever won't release her." Sawyer looked toward where the young woman slept wrapped in his blanket. Even in the deep darkness, he could make out the concerning paleness of her delicate face. "I've seen fevers like this before in my travels," Sawyer said knowingly. "She needs clean water, plenty of fresh water, and complete rest. Do you have a well near here?" There is one behind the cabin, but it's half filled with sand. We haven't been able to clean it ourselves. The work is too heavy. When the storm passes, I will clean it for you." Nolly looked at him with evident surprise in her dark eyes. "You said you would leave when the wind calms. Those were your words." "You said I should leave when the wind calms," Sawyer corrected calmly. "But I'm not going to leave you like this in this situation, not until the well is completely clean and Paloma is much better." For the first time since Sawyer had arrived at the cabin, he saw something completely different in Nolly's eyes. It wasn't trust yet, but neither was it the open hostility from before. It was something in between, like the first timid ray of sun after a long storm. "Why would you do that?" she asked directly. "You don't know us. You owe us nothing." Sawyer took a long moment before responding. He thought about his solitary life, the years spent completely alone, with no family waiting for him, no fixed home to return to. He thought about all the times he had desperately needed help, and no one had been there to give it. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally with conviction. "And because I know exactly what it feels like to be completely alone when everything seems lost and hopeless." Nolly didn't respond with words, but Sawyer noticed that her shoulders relaxed slightly for the first time. The silence that followed was very different from before, less tense, more comfortable, almost natural between them. Outside, the storm was beginning to slowly lose its destructive force. The furious howl of the wind gradually became a moan, then just a soft whisper. The sand stopped pounding against the walls so violently. Sawyer closed his heavy eyes, finally allowing himself to rest a little. Tomorrow there would be much work to do. But for now, in this little cabin lost in the middle of the desert, 10 women and 1 stranger had found a fragile but real truce. Just before falling completely asleep, Sawyer heard Nolly's voice one last time in the darkness. "Thank you for giving your blanket to Paloma." He didn't open his eyes, but a slight smile appeared on his tired face. "You're welcome, Nolly." The storm slowly moved away, carrying the dark night with it, and when the first golden rays of dawn began to filter through the dusty windows, something important had changed forever in that humble cabin. None of them knew it for certain yet, but fate had decided to unite their paths in a way that absolutely no one could have imagined. Dawn arrived with a silence almost sacred over the desert. The storm had passed completely, leaving the entire world covered in a fine layer of golden sand that sparkled in the light. The sky was perfectly clear, blue as a newborn's eyes, without a single cloud to mar its immense perfection. Sawyer was the first to wake when the first rays touched his face. He got up very carefully, stretching his sore muscles from the night spent on the hard, cold floor. The women were still sleeping deeply, exhausted from the accumulated tension of the past hours. Paloma was still wrapped in his blanket, her breathing much calmer than the night before. He walked to the door and opened it very slowly to avoid making noise. The fresh desert air hit his face gently, clean and completely renewed after the fierce storm. He breathed deeply several times, filling his lungs with that morning purity. Thunder neighed joyfully from the small stable, happy to hear his owner's footsteps approaching. Sawyer walked to him and stroked his neck with genuine affection. "We survived another hard night, boy," he murmured softly, "but it's not time for us to leave here yet." He returned to the cabin and found Nolly already awake, watching him intently from the dusty window. Her eyes no longer showed the hostility of the previous day, but not full trust either. It was noticeable progress. "The well is behind the cabin," she said in a neutral voice. "I'll show you exactly where." They walked together in silence toward the back of the cabin. The well was made of ancient stone, old but originally well built by skilled hands. However, the storm had filled it with sand up to about halfway. Sawyer rolled up his sleeves without hesitation. "I'll need a sturdy bucket and something to remove all this sand." Nolly nodded and quickly returned to the cabin. Minutes later, she came back with a worn wooden bucket and a somewhat rusty shovel. Sawyer began working immediately without complaint, removing sand bucket after bucket under the sun that was beginning to heat up strongly. An hour passed, then 2 more. The other women gradually woke up and came out curiously to watch the stranger working tirelessly. Some watched him with evident curiosity, others with something that was beginning to resemble genuine respect. Sawyer was pulling out the last heavy bucket of sand when Sitlali shouted from the cabin in an alarmed voice. "Riders! Riders are coming this way?" Sawyer's heart raced. He dropped the bucket and ran toward the front of the cabin as fast as he could. On the distant horizon, 4 dark figures on horseback were approaching, raising a large cloud of dust. Even from a considerable distance, Sawyer recognized the type of men they were. Dirty, worn-out hats, old, tattered clothes, threatening rifles crossed over their mounts. Bandits without a doubt. "All of you inside the cabin," Sawyer ordered in a firm, authoritative voice. "Now." Quickly, the women obeyed without a second's hesitation, rushing toward the cabin with urgency. Nolly was the last to enter, pausing briefly beside Sawyer. "There are 4 armed men," she said with concern. "You are only one against them. I've faced worse odds in my life, believe me." "Your gun is still inside," Sawyer swore silently. He had left his revolver on the cabin floor the night before as a gesture of peace and hadn't picked it up this morning. He looked at Nolly urgently. "Bring it to me." Quickly, Nolly disappeared inside the cabin and returned seconds later with the belt and revolver in her hands. Sawyer strapped it on with quick, practiced movements. "Stay inside with the other women, please." "This is my fight too, Sawyer. Nolly, please, trust me." Something in his serious voice made her finally obey. She entered the cabin but stayed by the window, watching everything attentively. The 4 riders arrived and stopped their horses about 20 meters from the cabin. The leader was a large, burly man with a deep scar crossing his left cheek and a crooked smile that held absolutely nothing friendly. His dark eyes scanned the entire property with poorly concealed greed. "Good morning, friend," the leader said in a mocking, contemptuous voice. "Nice place you have here, very cozy." Sawyer didn't move an inch from his position. His right hand rested casually but ready near his revolver. "This place isn't mine, I'm just passing through." The bandit looked directly toward the cabin and his eyes gleamed with interest. "We saw some movement in there. You've got company hiding." "Those people are my family," Sawyer said in a voice as cold as the hardest steel, "and they are completely under my personal protection." The bandits exchanged amused glances. The leader let out a loud, unpleasant laugh that echoed in the air. "Your family, you say? A solitary cowboy with an Apache family. What an interesting and curious situation." He leaned threateningly over his saddle. "Look, friend, we don't want any unnecessary trouble with you. We're just looking for some basic provisions. Food, fresh water, maybe some good horses, nothing too demanding. There's nothing here for you. Turn around now and leave the way you came." The bandit's mocking smile completely vanished from his face. His hand moved slowly but deliberately toward his weapon. "I don't think you're in a position to be giving orders, friend." Sawyer took a deep breath. For a moment, time seemed to stop completely around him. He could clearly feel the beating of his own heart, slow and absolutely steady. He could see every small detail with clarity, the bandit's hand reaching for his revolver, the nervous sweat on the foreheads of the other 3, the dust floating